All right, let's jump right in. Today we're going deep on a true audio classic, the Proton D1200 power amplifier.
Yeah, this one's special.
Definitely seems to have that reputation.
A real powerhouse. We've got a vintage review from way back in 1984 and the original owner's manual. Should be a fun one to dig into.
Now, just looking at pictures of this thing, it screams 80s, doesn't it?
Totally. Big, bold. You know those giant analog power meters?
Right.
The whole sleek black finish definitely makes a statement in any listening room, even today.
Yeah, I bet it does.
But the looks are just the beginning. What really sets this amp apart is its power, specifically its dynamic power on-demand circuitry.
DPD.
Exactly, DPD. That's what lets this thing punch way above its weight class.
I mean, I know this review was overwhelmingly positive,
Oh, yeah.
but just how powerful is this thing? The review called it the most powerful amp they'd ever tested, and this was 1984, right?
That's right. And, back then, the audio scene was exploding, so to be called the most powerful at that time is a serious claim.
A lot of competition to go up against.
And it wasn't cheap either. $599 back then, which, with inflation is over $1,200 today.
Yeah, that's definitely a premium price, even now.
But the crazy thing is, even at that price, it was considered a steal
Really?
because its performance was right up there with amps that cost way, way more. I mean, we're talking some serious high-end stuff.
So it wasn't just powerful, it was powerful and affordable.
Exactly. And it's actually a great example of something we talk about a lot on this show,
Which is?
that quality components and smart design can sometimes outperform just throwing money at the problem. This thing was built right.
Okay, so let's dig into the tech a bit here. How does this DPD, this dynamic power on demand, actually work?
So imagine you're a sprinter, right? And you're just exploding off the starting block.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
You need that initial burst of energy to get going. DPD is kind of like that. It has the secondary power supply that kicks in for those short bursts, like when the music really peaks.
Yeah.
And that's what gives it so much more power than its continuous rating suggests. Like, it's got reserves.
So it's not just about sustained power.
No.
It's about handling those demanding moments, those dynamic peaks in the music.
Right. And that's what gives you that real impact, that feeling of being there in the performance.
I'm guessing the reviewer was pretty impressed with the test results.
Yeah, to say the least. The numbers are pretty mind-blowing.
Lay on me.
So on paper, this amp is rated at 100 watts per channel.
Okay.
But in testing, it actually clipped at 155 watts into 8 ohms. And get this, 350 watts into 2 ohms.
Wow. So it's already exceeding its rating by a good margin there.
But wait, it gets even crazier when you look at the dynamic power figures.
Okay, let's hear about those. That's the DPD magic, right?
Exactly. Remember that sprinter analogy?
Mm-hmm.
Well, this amp delivered a whopping 593 watts into 8 ohms for a 20 millisecond burst.
Seriously.
That's almost 6 times its rated power.
That's insane.
And when they pushed it into 2 ohms, it hit, are you ready for this? 1,800 watts for that same burst.
1,800. I mean, is that even safe?
Well, it's safe if you have the right speakers and you're careful. But yeah, I mean, that's enough to power a small concert. I can't even imagine what that must sound like in person.
The reviewer described the impact of those high-level transients, like a cymbal crash or a drum solo, as stunning. Said not many so-called 100-watt amps can match that performance.
Not even close. It's not just about being loud, though. It's about capturing those nuances, that raw energy in the music with incredible realism.
So it's about fidelity as much as it is about sheer power.
Right. And that's what made the D1200 so special. It wasn't just brute force, it was musical. It made the music come alive.
Well, we're definitely getting a sense of why this amp has reached legendary status. But to put things in context, what was the amplifier landscape like back in 1984? What were other amps like at the time?
A lot of amps back then, especially at this price point, struggled to deliver that kind of power cleanly and consistently.
Right.
The D1200 really was a game changer. It kind of raised the bar for what was possible, especially for the average music lover.
So it wasn't just a great amp, it was a great amp for its time.
Exactly. And it really highlights how innovative Proton was.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the power, but what else contributed to the D1200's performance? What were some of the other design choices that made it stand out?
Well, one of the things the review focused on was the use of R-core power transformers.
R-core transformers. Now, I'm not an electrical engineer, so break that down for me. What are those and why are they important?
You got it. Think of them as like guardians of sonic purity. Our core transformers are amazing at minimizing noise and interference. Basically, they help ensure that the signal reaching your speakers is as clean and pure as possible.
Oh, I see. So it's like having a built-in noise filter.
Kinda, yeah. It's all about preserving the integrity of the music, letting you hear every detail, every nuance exactly as the artist intended.
So it's not just about power, it's about quality too.
Absolutely, it's the whole package.
Now, I know the owner's manual mentions something called bridged mode. What is that all about?
Ugh, bridged mode. This is where things get really interesting. Basically, it lets you transform the D1200 from a stereo amp into a monoblock.
A monoblock. And what does that mean exactly?
It means you're combining the power of both channels into one. So instead of having two channels, you have one super powerful channel.
So you're essentially doubling the output power.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like unleashing the beast.
That's incredible. What would you even use that kind of power for?
Well, it's great for driving a really demanding subwoofer. Or you could even use it to power an entire home theater system. It gives you that extra oomph for those big, explosive moments in movies.
It's like having two amps in one.
Exactly. And that just speaks to the versatility of this amp. Proton really thought of everything when they designed this thing.
It's amazing how much technology they packed into a single unit back then.
It really is. It was ahead of its time in so many ways. And, we haven't even touched on how its sound signature compares to modern amplifiers. That's a whole other conversation.
Well, that's a perfect segue into our next part. We'll be back after a short break to discuss how the D1200 stacks up against today's amps and whether its sound has stood the test of time.
Stay tuned. This is
Yeah.
going to be good. So, the world of amplifiers has come a long way since 1984.
That's an understatement, I'd say.
But the question is, how does the D1200's sound signature hold up against modern amps? Has time been kind to it?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a lot about the power and those impressive test results.
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's all about how it sounds. And taste in audio is pretty subjective, right?
Absolutely. What sounds amazing to one person might sound, not so great to someone else. It's all about personal preference.
So let's talk about the D1200 specifically.
Oh.
What can you tell us about its sound signature? Does it have that classic warm analog sound that some people rave about?
It does. And, a lot of that has to do with those R-core transformers we talked about.
Right.
They really do make a difference in terms of noise floor and just overall clarity. And Proton was known for using really high-quality components throughout their designs.
So it's not just about the power, it's about the attention to detail and the entire signal path.
Exactly. And, a lot of audiophiles still swear by that classic analog sound. They say it's got a certain richness, a depth that you don't always get with modern digital amps.
Right, so we have this sort of classic analog versus digital debate in audio.
Yeah.
And I imagine that debate will probably rage on forever.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those things where there's no clear winner. It really comes down to what you prefer.
And with the D1200, we're talking about a very specific type of analog sound, one that was shaped by the technology and design philosophies of the 1980s.
Right. And that's part of what makes it so interesting. It's like a sonic time capsule.
Taking us back to a different era in audio history.
Exactly. And, there's a certain charm to that.
Now, I know we've touched on this before, but how does the D1200 compare to modern amplifiers in terms of features? Obviously, technology has advanced quite a bit since 1984.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, modern amps, they often come with all sorts of bells and whistles. Digital inputs, Bluetooth connectivity, room correction software, you name it.
Right, a lot of convenience features that just weren't around back then.
And those features can be really appealing, especially if you want your system to be super integrated with your modern lifestyle.
But I imagine there's also something to be said for the simplicity of a classic amp like the D1200.
Oh, for sure. Sometimes less is more. And with an amp like this, you're not paying for features you might not even use. You're paying for pure audio performance.
So it really comes down to priorities.
Yeah.
What's important to you in a listening experience? Do you value those modern conveniences, or do you prefer the purity and simplicity of a vintage design?
It's a great point. And, it's not just about the features themselves. It's also about the overall philosophy of the design.
Okay, explain that.
Well, with a modern amp, you often have a lot of processing going on in the background. Digital signal processing, room correction, all that stuff. And while that can be great for tailoring the sound to your specific room and preferences, it can also introduce a certain level of artificiality.
Right, you're essentially adding another layer between the music in your ears.
Exactly. Whereas with a vintage amp like the D1200, it's all about the purity of the signal path. It's about letting the music speak for itself.
So it's like a more direct connection to the source.
Kind of, yeah. And, for some people, that's really important. They want to hear the music as it was originally intended without any additional processing.
And that makes sense. There's a certain romance to that idea, isn't there?
There is.
Experiencing the music the way it was heard back in the day.
And, that's part of the appeal of vintage audio in general. It's like a window into the past.
So it's not just about the sound quality. It's about the history, the nostalgia.
Exactly. It's a whole experience.
And speaking of experience, let's talk about what it's actually like to own a vintage amp, like the D1200. Are there any special considerations, anything potential buyers should keep in mind?
Well, one thing to remember is that this is a vintage piece of equipment, so it might require a bit more care and attention than a brand new amp.
Right.
Finding parts might be a bit more challenging, and you might need to find a technician who specializes in vintage audio if something needs repair.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not like you can just walk into any Best Buy and get it fixed.
Right. And, it's also important to think about the overall condition of the amp. Has it been well maintained? Are there any signs of wear and tear?
So it's really a buyer beware situation.
Kind of, yeah. But, if you do your research and find a well-preserved D1200, it can be a really rewarding experience.
Now, I know we talked about the price being over $1,200 in today's money. How does that compare to modern amplifiers with similar power and features?
Well, it's hard to make an exact comparison because technology has changed so much. But I'd say that a modern amp with comparable power, features, and build quality could easily cost 2 or 3 times as much as a D1200.
Wow. So it's actually a pretty good value even today.
It is. And, vintage audio equipment is becoming increasingly collectible.
Oh, interesting.
So a well-maintained D1200 could actually appreciate in value over time.
So it's not just a great amp, it could be a good investment too.
Exactly. And, that's something to think about when you're comparing it to a modern amp. With a modern amp, you're pretty much guaranteed that it's going to depreciate in value as soon as you buy it.
Right, like most electronics these days.
Whereas with a vintage piece, you have the potential for it to actually go up in value.
Well, that's certainly an added bonus.
It is.
But even without the investment potential, the fact that the D1200 can still hold its own against modern amps speaks volumes about its quality.
It really does. It's a testament to Proton's engineering and their commitment to building products that last.
And it's a great reminder that sometimes the best technology isn't always the newest.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's the stuff that was built to stand the test of time.
Right. And, that's a message that I think is really important in today's world of disposable electronics.
Agree.
It's about choosing quality over quantity.
Hmm.
And, the D1200 is a perfect example of that philosophy.
Well said. Now, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Proton D1200, I'm curious to hear your final thoughts. What are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they keep in mind as they navigate the world of audio and decide what's right for them?
All right, so as we wrap up our deep dive into the Proton D1200.
It's been quite a journey.
Yeah, really fascinating to look back at this classic piece of audio gear.
And see how it stacks up against today's technology.
Exactly. I mean, we've talked about the power, the design, the sound, the features.
The history.
Yeah, the whole package. And, I think there's some really important takeaways here for anyone who's interested in audio, whether you're a seasoned audiophile or just starting out.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who might be on the hunt for a new amplifier or just curious about vintage audio, what are some key things they should keep in mind based on our exploration of the D1200?
Well, first and foremost, I'd say don't get too hung up on specs.
Okay, expand on that a bit.
I mean, specs are important, don't get me wrong, but they only tell part of the story. The D1200 is a perfect example of that.
Right, it exceeded its specs in pretty much every test.
Exactly. And, that's because it was designed with a focus on overall quality and performance, not just hitting certain numbers on a spec sheet.
So it's about looking beyond the numbers, considering the bigger picture.
Right. And I'd say that applies to choosing any audio equipment, not just amplifiers.
That's good advice. So what else?
Well, another big takeaway is don't underestimate the value of vintage audio. Pieces like the D1200 often offer incredible performance and build quality at a fraction of the cost of comparable modern equipment.
And we've seen that vintage audio can be a good investment too.
Absolutely. And there's also a certain charm to owning a piece of audio history.
Right, that nostalgia factor can be pretty powerful.
It can. And for some people, it's not just about the sound, it's about the experience, the connection to the past.
It's like owning a classic car or a vintage watch.
Exactly. It's about appreciating the craftsmanship and the history behind the object.
And I think that ties into a broader point about mindful consumption.
Oh, absolutely.
Choosing quality over quantity, investing in things that are built to last.
Right. And, in today's world where everything seems to be designed to be disposable, That's a really important message.
It is. And the D1200 is a shining example of that philosophy. It was built to last.
Yeah. And even though it was released over 40 years ago, it's still relevant today. It can still hold its own against modern amps.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is. And that's because it was designed with a focus on timeless principles. Quality components, smart design, and a commitment to performance.
And those principles never go out of style.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into the Proton D1200, I think the biggest takeaway is this.
I'm listening.
Whether you're looking for a new amplifier, a turntable, a pair of speakers, whatever it may be, take the time to do your research.
Right.
Think about what's important to you. Consider your budget, your listening habits, your lifestyle.
And don't be afraid to explore different options.
Exactly. The world of audio is vast and there's something out there for everyone, but most importantly, trust your ears.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The journey of finding the right audio gear is all part of the fun.
It is. And, at the end of the day, it's all about finding that sound, that experience that moves you.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Proton D1200. It's been a pleasure exploring this audio legend with you.
Likewise. Always happy to geek out about audio.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating piece of audio technology. Until then, happy listening.